During a House Oversight Committee hearing, Representative Jasmine Crockett took a powerful and unapologetic stand against efforts to undermine diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) policies, particularly as they relate to the expansion of broadband infrastructure. The conversation began with criticisms directed at the Biden administration's focus on DEI in its broadband initiatives. These criticisms suggested that DEI initiatives were responsible for failures in broadband deployment, implying that prioritizing inclusion had compromised efficiency or technological competency. Crockett immediately pushed back on this assertion with precision and an unflinching resolve. Her response was not just a rebuttal, it was a moment of real-time clarity in a room where nuance is often lost in political point scoring. She focused her critique on the false narrative that DEI policies are inherently antithetical to competence. By questioning the premise that inclusion leads to inefficiency, she shifted the discussion away from inflammatory rhetoric and toward historical evidence. Crockett pointed out that delays and cost overruns in broadband deployment had been occurring long before the implementation of DEI-focused policies. She brought attention to the fact that government broadband programs had a documented history of underestimating costs and mismanaging resources long before there was any formal commitment to DEI principles. This context was crucial because it exposed how DEI is often used as a scapegoat for structural or operational inefficiencies that have existed for decades. Instead of examining systemic issues like outdated cost projections, lack of regulatory oversight, or misaligned public-private partnerships, the focus had shifted to blaming policies aimed at creating equity. Crockett refused to allow that misdirection to stand unchallenged. She emphasized that attributing failures in broadband expansion to DEI ignores the much larger and more complex dynamics that contribute to those failures. Her comments also highlighted how narratives around competence and qualification are weaponized against those pushing for inclusion. Crockett understood the implications of blaming DEI for technical setbacks. It subtly implies that individuals benefiting from those policies are less capable or undeserving. She turned that logic on its head by making it clear that many of the same people who now critique DEI had been silent or even complicit when the broadband initiative suffered from poor planning and underperformance in previous years. Moreover, her argument was a masterclass in reframing. Instead of simply defending DEI, she went further to explain how such policies could enhance the quality and effectiveness of broadband deployment. By including diverse perspectives and communities in planning and implementation, DEI can actually lead to smarter, more sustainable infrastructure. Crockett's insights showed that when traditionally underserved populations are involved in decision-making, the outcomes are more inclusive and ultimately more successful. She offered a vision where equity and excellence are not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. The most striking part of her contribution was her use of data and precedent to dismantle the opposing viewpoint. She didn't rely on emotional appeal or vague references. She provided specific examples of past program failures and linked them to long-standing bureaucratic shortcomings. This methodical approach demonstrated that blaming DEI was not just wrong, it was intellectually lazy and dishonest. Crockett's approach reminded everyone in the room that sound policymaking demands more than partisan talking points. It requires critical thinking and a willingness to examine the actual record. Her tone throughout the exchange remained firm yet respectful. There was no yelling, no grandstanding, just a clear, confident articulation of facts and principles. In doing so, she modeled exactly the kind of leadership that DEI seeks to elevate: qualified, informed individuals who bring unique and valuable perspectives to the table. It was a reminder that those advocating for inclusion are not asking for special treatment. They're demanding fair consideration based on merit and lived experience. Crockett's refusal to accept the false binary between diversity and competency served as a potent counter-narrative. She demonstrated that DEI is not a distraction from the mission, it's central to achieving it. Her defense of these principles was not only about policy, but also about dignity. It was a declaration that the communities often ignored or blamed in national conversations have the knowledge, skills, and right to be at the forefront of progress. In doing so, she turned what was meant to be a political trap into an opportunity to elevate the truth. During the heated and highly publicized exchange at the House Oversight Committee hearing, Representative Jasmine Crockett delivered a compelling and impassioned defense of her own qualifications, confronting the pervasive issue of how Black women in power are too often unfairly scrutinized or dismissed. In the face of suggestions that her support of DEI policies somehow implied a lack of merit or competence, Crockett did not just respond, she asserted her presence and made it abundantly clear that her credentials are beyond question. Rather than allowing the insinuations to go unanswered, she stood firm and listed her accomplishments without apology. She made it known that she holds a bachelor's degree, a Juris Doctor, and even an honorary doctorate. These academic achievements are not superficial decorations. They are tangible evidence of her intellectual rigor and sustained commitment to education. In a political climate where qualifications are often politicized or selectively acknowledged, Crockett's transparency was a powerful moment. It reminded everyone in the room that no one should be forced to defend their right to be at the table, especially when they've already proven themselves through both education and experience. But Crockett didn't stop at academic credentials. She noted that she has nearly 2 decades of legal practice under her belt. This isn't symbolic experience, it's substantive. As a practicing attorney, she is engaged with the law in the most concrete ways possible, working on behalf of clients, navigating complex legal systems, and interpreting the very statutes she's now helping to shape as a legislator. It is not unusual for members of Congress to come from legal backgrounds, but what is often overlooked is how women of color who carry the same credentials as their peers are too frequently met with skepticism rather than respect. Crockett, by asserting the depth of her career, called out this double standard in real time. Adding further weight to her resume, she mentioned her rank as a lieutenant colonel in the Civil Air Patrol. This role reflects leadership, service, and a high level of discipline, qualities that reinforce her fitness not just to serve, but to lead. In a single statement, she cut through the unspoken coded implications that she was less than, and demonstrated that her path to public service has been one marked by achievement, dedication, and leadership across multiple domains. Her professional journey is the kind that would be celebrated without question if her identity fit a different mold. What made her defense so striking was not just the content, but the context. She was not on trial, but the nature of the exchange made it feel as if she had to prove herself in ways that others might never be asked to. This is precisely the point she underscored. By vocalizing the reality that Black women are constantly put in positions where they must overperform just to be seen as equal, she exposed a painful and persistent truth. There is a deeply embedded cultural pattern of assuming incompetence when it comes to women of color, especially in spaces of power. Crockett refused to conform to that pattern. She did not ask for respect, she demanded it by simply presenting the facts of her life. Her words resonated as more than personal defense. They were a form of collective advocacy. In laying out her accomplishments, she was speaking not just for herself, but for every highly qualified woman who has ever been underestimated, for every accomplished Black professional who has had to navigate skepticism wrapped in politeness or outright condescension. Her message was clear. Qualifications should speak for themselves, but when they don't, there's power in naming them, proudly and unapologetically. Throughout her remarks, Crockett maintained her composure, choosing clarity and confidence over confrontation. This approach further amplified her credibility. She didn't raise her voice, but the power of her words echoed loudly. She made visible the kind of emotional labor required of those who are routinely forced to prove their worth in systems that weren't built to recognize it. And still, she did so without bitterness, only truth. By directly addressing the insinuations cast her way and using them as a platform to reassert her value, Crockett redefined the terms of the conversation. She was not going to shrink to fit the expectations imposed on her. Instead, she expanded the space, proving that qualification is not just about degrees or years of experience, but about resilience, clarity, and the ability to hold firm when challenged by prejudice. In the course of the congressional exchange that captured national attention, Representative Jasmine Crockett brought to the forefront a deeply entrenched societal issue: the systemic undervaluation of black women's qualifications and expertise. She used the moment not merely to defend herself, but to call out a broader cultural pattern that consistently cast doubt on the legitimacy of black women in positions of authority, no matter how accomplished they are. Her words were not only a rebuttal to a specific challenge, but a powerful articulation of the ways in which structural bias infiltrates public perception and policy discourse alike. Crockett's remarks were anchored in lived experience and the awareness that, time and again, women of color are forced to prove their worth in ways that others are not. She explained with calm determination that no matter how much she has achieved, whether through higher education, professional success, or public service, there remains an undercurrent of skepticism that she must confront. This skepticism is not based on her work ethic, nor her ability to govern, but rather on assumptions tied to her identity. In pointing this out, she laid bare a truth that resonates across many sectors. Black women are routinely expected to overperform just to be deemed qualified by standards that are neither fixed nor fair. Her personal accomplishments were not offered as a boast, but as a response to a system that too often demands receipts from black professionals. She made it clear that this demand for validation is not equally applied. Her presence in Congress, supported by degrees, legal experience, and leadership roles, would be unquestioned if she fit a different demographic mold. Yet instead of being presumed competent, she is asked, explicitly or implicitly, to prove it again and again. This double standard is at the heart of what she sought to dismantle. By vocalizing the ways in which her capabilities are scrutinized differently, Crockett illuminated a broader dynamic of erasure that impacts black women in public life. This isn't just a political problem, it's a social one. Across boardrooms, classrooms, and courtrooms, the contributions of black women are often minimized, appropriated, or ignored. The consequences are not only personal, but structural. Policies shaped without input from diverse perspectives, leadership pipelines that exclude qualified individuals, and a public narrative that equates whiteness or maleness with authority. Crockett's intervention was timely and necessary. She exposed the subtle mechanisms through which bias operates, not always through overt racism or misogyny, but through the quiet erosion of credibility. When a black woman speaks, her words are more likely to be questioned. When she leads, her decisions are more likely to be second-guessed. When she succeeds, her success is more likely to be attributed to affirmative action than ability. These patterns, left unchecked, become part of the very fabric of professional and public life. What made Crockett's remarks especially powerful was the fact that she didn't just name these patterns, she dismantled them in real time. By standing confidently in her achievements, she reclaimed the narrative and challenged others to confront their own biases. She turned what could have been a moment of defensiveness into a lesson in self-advocacy and truth-telling. There was no need for grandiosity. Her facts spoke volumes. Her strength lay in her composure and clarity, in the calm insistence that she belonged exactly where she was. In framing her experience within a broader societal context, Crockett also gestured toward the importance of institutional change. The issue is not just about one person being misunderstood, it's about entire systems that are built on outdated and inequitable assumptions about who gets to lead, who gets to be heard, and who gets to be believed. Her words pushed the conversation beyond the surface of individual qualification to the roots of collective inequity. Importantly, she didn't position herself as an exception to the rule, but as a representative of countless others who face the same devaluation. She made clear that her experience, while personal, is part of a shared reality for many black women who are expected to endure these indignities quietly. By speaking out, she gave voice to that shared struggle and helped to make it visible in a space where it's often denied or dismissed. Through that moment, Crockett showed that naming the problem is a form of resistance. She offered no apologies, asked for no validation, and made no concessions. Instead, she reminded everyone watching that systemic bias thrives in silence, and that the most powerful way to confront it is to speak boldly, truthfully, and without fear. Representative Jasmine Crockett's impassioned remarks during the House Oversight Committee hearing went beyond a defense of individual merit. They opened the door to a wider conversation about representation, equity, and the enduring barriers that continue to challenge the presence of marginalized communities in positions of power. What began as a pointed response to a specific critique evolved into a moment that illuminated the larger stakes involved when discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion surface in national policy debates. Crockett did not speak only as a public official defending her own qualifications. She became a voice for the communities that are often spoken about, but rarely given the opportunity to speak for themselves. Her presence in that room represented a convergence of voices historically left out of policymaking: Black Americans, women, and particularly Black women whose leadership is too frequently undermined by unspoken assumptions and explicit challenges. In that space, she confronted not just an individual's opinion, but a structural narrative that suggests diversity is somehow at odds with competence. The issue at hand was not merely about one person's resume. It was about the deeply ingrained societal notion that elevating underrepresented voices is a risk to excellence. Crockett challenged that idea at its core. She demonstrated that representation does not mean sacrificing quality, it means expanding the scope of who gets to contribute to shaping the country's future. Her argument was built not on theoretical ideals, but on lived experience and tangible results. She brought attention to how communities have long been excluded from decision-making processes that directly impact their lives, and how DEI efforts are meant to correct that imbalance, not to dilute standards but to broaden access. By asserting herself with confidence, she highlighted that diversity is not about checking boxes. It is about recognizing the wealth of knowledge, resilience, and leadership that exists outside the traditional power structures. Her words reflected the frustration of many who have had to fight twice as hard to be seen as legitimate, not because they lacked qualifications, but because of who they are. Crockett refused to accept the notion that her identity disqualified her from being effective. On the contrary, she argued that her identity enriched her perspective and her ability to lead in ways that others might overlook or undervalue. Her stance offered a vivid counter to the false dichotomy that often frames DEI as a trade-off between inclusion and capability. She pushed the conversation forward by insisting that inclusion is not a distraction, it is a critical lens through which better decisions are made. Representation brings nuance, insight, and accountability. It ensures that policies reflect the realities of the people they affect. In a nation as diverse as the United States, governing without that breadth of perspective leads to policy blind spots that can perpetuate harm. Crockett's remarks also served to underscore the emotional and psychological toll that comes with constantly having to prove oneself in environments where your presence is already considered an anomaly. For many people in underrepresented communities, public service is not just a career, it's a space where they must repeatedly justify their place, not only to opponents, but sometimes to their own colleagues and constituents. She illuminated this dynamic with clarity, helping others understand that these pressures are not imagined. They are part of a larger pattern of marginalization that must be acknowledged and addressed. Through her assertive yet measured delivery, she redefined what leadership looks like. It is not defined by conforming to outdated expectations, but by challenging systems that have long operated without accountability to all Americans. Her perspective as a Black woman is not a liability, it is a strength. It adds value to legislative discussions that often lack the depth of understanding that comes with first-hand experience. She made the case that inclusive governance is not just ethically right, but practically necessary in a pluralistic society. Crockett's ability to transform a moment of questioning into a broader reflection on equity and justice illustrates the power of representation in real time. She turned what could have been a routine exchange into a reminder that marginalized voices belong at the center of the conversation, not at the margins. Her contribution was not only to the topic at hand, but to the evolving understanding of what democracy demands, a diversity of thought, experience, and leadership that mirrors the people it is meant to serve. Representative Jasmine Crockett's intervention at the House Oversight Committee hearing was more than a personal rebuttal. It was a defining moment in the broader national discourse on race, gender, and representation in American governance. By standing firm in her identity, qualifications, and values, she illustrated what it means to lead with both integrity and courage in a system that has not always made space for voices like hers. Her words, measured yet powerful, reminded the country that leadership is not confined to a particular background, pedigree, or demographic. It is shaped by lived experience, informed judgment, and an unwavering commitment to equity and justice. In an environment where the legitimacy of DEI efforts is constantly under fire, Crockett refused to allow inclusion to be framed as a weakness. Instead, she presented it as a strength, a necessity even, for a functioning modern democracy. Her defense of these principles was not rooted in ideology alone, but in the real consequences of erasing or diminishing the contributions of marginalized communities. She illustrated that when policies are crafted without the input of those most affected, they inevitably fail to serve their purpose. Representation, in her framing, is not a symbolic gesture. It is foundational to effective governance. Crockett also spoke directly to the exhaustion that comes with constantly being forced to validate one's presence. Her pointed reflections on how Black women's qualifications are routinely second-guessed served as both personal testimony and social critique. She made visible the emotional labor that accompanies public service for women of color, the persistent demand to be twice as prepared, twice as credentialed, and twice as composed, just to receive half the recognition. Yet rather than be diminished by these pressures, she used the moment to educate, advocate, and assert. What unfolded was not a spectacle of confrontation, but a masterclass in conviction. Crockett showed how to confront bias without losing poise, how to assert worth without seeking permission, and how to challenge power without replicating its most harmful tendencies. Her ability to transform a dismissive exchange into a teachable moment was a testament to both her leadership and her readiness to shape the future of American politics, not despite who she is, but because of it. In the end, her words did not merely defend her own qualifications. They elevated a shared struggle and called others to reflect on the systemic dynamics that continue to sideline capable voices. She turned the spotlight onto the assumptions embedded in the room and asked everyone present and watching to consider not just what they expect from leaders, but who they allow to become one. Through clarity, resolve, and purpose, Jasmine Crockett delivered a message that echoed far beyond the walls of Congress. Representation is not up for debate, and excellence is not